I gained my Portuguese citizenship with just a hint of my family history. Now, everyone dreams of living a laid-back life in Europe. Man, guess what? Until 2009, I had no idea I could have had this chance for my entire life. My interest in Portuguese citizenship sparked when my mom's cousin once visited my home with a box of sweets and showed me this European citizen card. So the moment I saw that card, I couldn't help the feeling of being a bit jealous and sensed its immense value and potential to have it myself. So I quickly asked him, what's the process? How do I go about getting my citizen card? Now, I was aware that my family has been from Goa for generations. So my uncle advised me that I need to gather certain documents to begin the process. So I asked, what are these documents? So he introduced me to this agent who explained that I needed to gather the birth details of my grandfather or my grandmother, and if possible, their marriage record. However, at that time, I didn't know my grandmother's or grandfather's date of birth. So I started gathering information about my grandparents. But to tell you the truth, I didn't even know their correct names or the actual date of birth or which year they were actually born. My mother even couldn't provide substantial details on that date of birth or when they got married. So fortunately, my mother's elder sister knew certain details which I wrote down on this white piece of paper, this small piece of paper. So this only included my grandfather's name and the year he was born, potentially, and my grandmother's name and the year she was born, potentially. And she confirmed that they were both born in Goa. That's all the information I had. So I then headed to the archives confident that I had what I needed and actually found my grandmother's birth record. But then I was asked to dig even deeper and uncover details about my grandmother's parents. I'm like, what the f? Now, since my grandmother was born in 1902, that is 19,002, so her parents were most likely born in the 1800s. So until here, everything went smoothly. But here, the conditions became worse. Why? Just look at this picture. So from here, I needed to extract the information, and you can notice that these papers are in pieces. The words written on these pages are dull, cursive, and indecipherable. Wait, so I won't just give you the brief of the whole process. Let's get in the detailed description of each step so you can follow the same process for your access to Europe. So first, I have made a PDF document. I call this Amelia's Process. That's my grandma's name. So during Amelia's Process, I began with a simple white piece of paper that my mother's elder sister gave me back in 2010-2011. On that paper, my grandmother's name was written as Amelia de Oliveira, supposedly born in 1902. I also had this other paper that mentioned my grandfather's name as Sebastian Pereira, born in 1901. This was the starting point for my journey to uncover more about my family's history. And this was the only hint I had at that time. I remember people saying that a single piece of paper cannot decide my future. But I guess in this case, it just did. So I now had to decide whether to begin the process from my grandma's side or my grandpa's side. As I started searching through the piles of papers, I realized that finding documents on my grandma's side was much easier. So the church my grandma belonged to was very cooperative when gathering information about my grandma's side as compared to the church on my grandpa's side. If you find yourself in a similar situation where you are finding it difficult to locate details for both your grandparents, it's perfectly fine to start with the easier option first. So the very first document I obtained was my grandmother's baptism certificate, which was not the main document I needed, but this served as a supporting piece of evidence for me to get the main document. Knowing that my grandparents were both Catholics, now this was crucial because it allowed me to access their births and marriage records directly from the church. For those whose grandparents are non-Catholics, the process might be a bit more challenging. So once I had the baptism certificate, I took it to the archives that's in Banjam, and there I was able to use this certificate to locate my grandmother's birth year. And that's how I discovered my grandmother's birth year through this process. Guys, make sure you're writing down the details here. Okay, so I found my grandma's birth certificate in 2014, and here's a picture of her birth certificate. or a birth theor as you call it. Next, I had to search for 2 supporting documents, which includes documents of my great grandparents. Remember the ones I told you who were born in the 1800s? So I was able to find the baptism certificate of my grandma's father. His name was Manuel Oliveira. I then moved on to locating the marriage certificate of my great-grandparents, which I successfully found, by the way, through research. Here's what it looks like. Next, I searched for the death certificate of my grandmother, which I found pretty easily. What I then needed next was a residence proof that showed that my grandmother indeed lived in India between 1974 and 1975, which again I retrieved from the records, and here's a picture of how the residency proof looks like. So here are the step-by-step details for you to register your birth before liberation. Birth certificate and birth theor of the registrant, the death certificate of the registrant, that's in case the registrant has passed away, 2 or more old documents. Now the old documents could be like an old Portuguese passport, Paraviyajam, birth theors of the registrant parents or their marriage theor, the residency certificate between 1974 to 1975, which says during that time the registrant was indeed in India. Now whenever it's not the registrant who is applying, example, whenever it's a descendant of the person, in that case, the birth certificate of the descendant would also be needed. In addition, you would also need a copy of the descendant's passport and a true copy of the descendant's second ID card. In this case, maybe an Aadhaar card. Now that I had all my documents ready, I began the first phase of my process. So at the time, this initial phase took me around 2 years, so I began this process in 2014-2015. Conducting this research felt like working on a PhD thesis because everything is written in Portuguese. And the reason for this was that for 450 years, Goa was a Portuguese territory, which meant that most of the government records were maintained in Portuguese rather than English. So after completing the first phase, I moved on to the next round of the process, which was equally complex. That's registering my grandmother's marriage. The first document I needed to locate for this stage was the marriage theor of my grandparents. Once again, I visited the church and obtained a copy of this record. From there to continue with the next step of the process. So use a brownie tip. If the person has a church marriage certificate and if the bishop of Goa attests that certificate, then the marriage certificate from the church itself can be legalized into a proper marriage certificate. So I opted to legalize the church marriage certificate, after which the next step was to search for my grandpa's birth certificate. I was informed that he was born in the 1900s, so I returned back to church to continue my search. By now it feels like I know most of the churches in Goa. I requested for a copy of this baptism certificate and received it in 2014 February. This helped me in applying for his birth theor, and here's a picture of his birth theor. Along with this, I had also successfully transcribed my grandmother's birth in Portugal, and after 2 years had received her Assento de Nascimento, which is her birth record in Portugal. And these were the first 2 processes in my journey that helped me in getting my Portuguese passport. In fact, I got my Portuguese passport and citizenship this year, and I vividly remember the day I started this journey. In fact, what I do remember pretty clearly was my first time to the Portuguese consulate in Goa. So I remember standing in this queue at one door, and from the other door, people coming out with big smiles with their Portuguese passport. So at that time, I did feel unsure, confused, amateurish, tense, wondering if I would ever get this opportunity. In fact, during my search of gathering documents, at a time I got so frustrated, but then I stopped the entire process for 1 year. So I guess I took a 1 year break. So what I'm getting at is there are no guarantees. The applicant queue was lengthy and is still lengthy, and the process is still time consuming. However, with patience, my dream became a reality. It is a rewarding and fulfilling experience that taught me the value of perseverance and determination. So if you have a similar dream and you want to test your luck, then make sure to book a free one-on-one consultation with me today, where I will answer all your questions for 20 minutes straight out. Also feel free to drop a comment below if you have any questions. I'll see you in the next video.